In today's video, I'm going to be showing you how I made this chef's knife forged from 1084 steel. Hopefully this video can be a helpful guide to teach you how to make your very first chef's knife. Like I said, this is 1084 and the stock I'm using is 2 inches wide and 3/16 of an inch thick. Now when you're forging thin steel, it's going to want a potato chip and banana and warp, and not warp, but just bend all over the place. So you constantly have to be moving the steel from up on edge down onto the flat. Once your steel gets up to temp for the first time, it's going to come up to temp a lot faster after that. So the longest you'll have to wait is for the very first heat. And if you don't let it get too cool before you put it back in, you're going to get more done faster. Now, one thing I will add is that this is probably a good project if you've made a couple knives already. As a very first knife, this might be extremely challenging. I like to think of forging as getting the shape 80 to 90% of the way there. Now, as I'm getting to the end of shaping the tip, I gotta really be careful and make sure I forge this down flat. The edges get thicker as you're smashing them. So I'm really careful to make sure I'm forging those back down. And you can see a little divot here in the center. And until that's gone, you haven't forged these back to their original thickness, and you want to make sure you do that. Now that I have my profile shape started, I'm going to clean it up a little bit and then create a separation between the blade and the tang. Using my anvil, I mark out how long I want the blade to be, which is about 9 inches. Transfer that mark to my steel, and then I use something called a half face blow, where half your hammer is hanging over the edge of the anvil and half is striking down just above. And as you can see, this pushes the material down, creating a shoulder. It also mushrooms up the top edge pretty bad, so you have to go back and forth. Now I'm not just hitting it over the edge, I'm also coming back up and addressing it from the top of the anvil, correcting all the craziness that's happening from forging it with those half-face blows. Once I have my shoulder forged down to about half the width that it was originally, I'm ready to trim my material off and forge out my tang. To do this, I'm using something called a hot cut. Your steel's going to want to bounce around on the hot cut, so make sure you reset it every time you hit until you have a groove deep enough that it's not going to jump out as easily. Resist the temptation to keep swinging on a different part of the anvil with this hot cut in. If you punch that, you might punch your finger right off your hand. Now I can get the tang tapered as well. Same principles, keep it hot and keep it moving. Now we want to taper the tang in thickness as well. We can implement those half-face blows again, working back and forth to quickly draw down the material. And then once at the end, I'll clean the profile back up, get the bumps out with the flat side. And I've just tapered my tang effectively in one heat. So the next step in the forging process is to start pulling the width out, beveling, but starting at the heel. The most important part on the chef's knife is the gap that you create between where your knuckles are going to be holding the handle and where the cutting board starts. You don't want to run your knuckles into the cutting board. So I'm going to be using the cross peen, and when you smack the steel like this, it's concentrating the force of the blow just in one direction and spreading the material away this direction, giving me more width in a very targeted area, which is the heel of the knife. As you're beveling, it's even more important than ever to move your steel. Don't just do one side down on the anvil. Flip it back and forth. Now, the reason that you need to move the steel back and forth from side to side and do the same amount of work on one side as you did the other is the anvil's what's called a heat sink. Now, a heat sink steals the heat from the steel, and if you take a full heat on one side only, you're going to forge very unevenly, especially with thin steel like you use for a chef's knife. Alright, I'm at the very end of this process. One thing I'm doing is checking for any waviness along the edge. Typically that means, well, it can mean one of two things. It could mean that your profile itself is wavy, but it could also mean that your thickness is different. The peaks are thinner and the valleys are thicker. And if that's the case, you know that you need to forge the valleys a little bit thinner, and it's going to even it out. I forged my bevel so that my edge thickness is about 1/8 of an inch. And with that completed, I can move on to the heat treat, which starts with normalizing. Now, before I begin the heat treating, I'm going to start by checking to see how straight my blade is. And this is really important. You don't want to quench a blade that you didn't put through any kind of straightening effort. And it's easiest, I've found, to sight down from the tip to the tang. You can see where I need to correct the blade. I'm not going to go in for another heat unless it's major. If it's just a minor change, I'm going to do that at this heat that I have right now. One really helpful trick is to turn your PSI on your regulator down. You don't need it quite as hot for this. Normalizing consists of 3 separate heats. In between each, you allow the steel to cool down to black in the still air. Each temp is getting a little bit cooler than the previous. The first is 1650, 1500, and then 1350. This undoes the stress of forging and also reduces the grain size of the steel. Now, my quench oil sits outside, which means it's probably really cold, and that's not ideal for getting maximum hardness out of your blades. Now, I'm going to preheat mine. It's kind of just a cowboy method, but it works. Taking a piece of hot steel, quenching it inside the oil, and changing the viscosity. You can take 2 pieces of angle iron, aluminum, or even wood to clamp your blade between directly after quench. That's going to keep the steel from warping to one side or the other and give you a better chance at having a straight blade. Immediately after quench, I brought the blade home and tempered it at 350 degrees for 2 2-hour cycles. This takes away some hardness, but it also takes away brittleness and gives you a tough knife. After the temper, I start grinding the profile of the knife, including the shoulders. Now, if you're interested in making this exact profile blade, you can follow the link in the description for a copy of the profile shape that you can print out and transfer to your knives at home. All right, so got it profiled, and all I did was just clean it up. I just made every bumpy surface smooth, just made sure that there's no like peaks and valleys. Next thing is to start grinding the bevels. It's really a good idea to use brand new belts. Old belts are gonna, like I said earlier, burn the steel. They're not gonna actually really grind the steel. They're not gonna cut it. Like a new belt actually like cuts the steel. But you can tell if it's grinding the way it's supposed to, it's actually cutting the steel by the way the shavings stick together. They'll stick together like a blanket, like that. The bad belt, it's just gonna be a pile of like metal dust. But if it's a good belt, if it's doing what it should, you're gonna have basically like a big blanket of what looks like steel wool. this is the goal. This is the end goal, is for you to get your grind to be flat or 90% flat, and then like sloped down, convex the last little bit so that you have essentially an edge. Right now it's probably like 1/1000th of an inch thick, just thick enough that your eye can still register it as having a flat across the top. Could stop here. This would be a perfectly functional kitchen knife. It would cut really well. I want to do something a little bit extra on this knife, and that is to grind in what's called an S grind. So a slight shallow on either side, using a different platen for my grinder. Something that helps me a lot when I'm grinding is watching the shadow right at the edge of the knife where it's casting a shadow onto the belt. Now, if there's no shadow, that means you're grinding with pressure right at the edge. And obviously, if there's a little bit of shadow, that means you're just behind the edge. And keeping an eye on how even that shadow is throughout is going to be a huge help in grinding an even bevel. I'm also going to mark out. The materials I'm using for my handle are black paper micarta and desert ironwood. Desert ironwood is naturally rot resistant, incredibly dense. It's not going to get damaged by water, so it's the perfect wood to use for a kitchen knife. Now, I just drilled the holes out for the ting slot with a handheld drill. And next, I'm using a Dremel to clean up the sides so that the ting can slide through nice and even. Bolster is done. The shoulders are inset into the material. It's not an airtight fit. It's not a totally perfect fit, but I've got a really easy fix for that you'll see once we get to the glue up. I use a Sharpie to lay out the lines of my tang onto my handle material, just because Sharpie is really easy to see against the brown color of the ironwood. While it's totally not necessary to use a drill press, I did just so I have one hole that's going down perfectly straight. And from there, I use the handheld drill to widen the slot out. You got to be super careful doing it like this. I've done a lot of knives like this, and I've learned my lesson. If you go outside of those lines that you marked, in the end, you could be carving your handle and grind right through that channel, exposing a big, ugly opening at the very end of the process. So if you're going to use the drill like I did, just be careful and aware that you might screw it up. At least on the first one. After the tang slot is ground and I made sure that the tang actually fits inside of it, I'm grinding these little notches into the tang. Now these are going to give the epoxy something to bite onto and will give it a more secure grip inside the handle. Now I want to drill a pin hole through because my client really likes these little mosaic pins. To do that and make sure that it's actually soft enough, I'm heating the tang up to blue using the torch, and hopefully this softens the steel up enough that I can drill a pinhole through. Now you could totally avoid having to use the torch just by being really careful not to quench the tang. I was pretty sure that I didn't quench the tang, but just for that peace of mind, I also hit it with the torch to be double sure. Now mixing up the epoxy, you want to make sure that you really mix it up. You don't want to have some mixed up and others not mixed up and then have a loose fit in the end, or epoxy that doesn't cure. And we are now seeing the trick I was talking about, and it's literally just as simple as putting black dye in the epoxy. Since the bolster is made out of black paper micarta, the black epoxy is going to blend into it perfectly, and in the end it's going to look like you carved a literally perfect fit, when in reality you probably didn't. And if you did, you're just a better knife maker than I am, and good for you. That's pretty awesome. To give my clamp two flat surfaces to clamp onto, I put two pieces of wood clamped onto the blade that clear the tip. Make sure there's no obvious gaps anywhere. You want your clamp in line with where the tang ends, so that the pressure is nice and even on this thing. And if everything's lined up and looks good, it's time to sit back and watch paint dry, or in this case, let epoxy cure. Make sure you let it actually cure. Don't start working this too early. And the epoxy is cured. You can tell just by checking whatever you mix your epoxy on. For the handle, the first thing that you want to do is grind the sides down so that they're nice and flat and in line with the blade. Now you can use a granite stone and then a marking gauge to draw a center line that lines up perfectly with your blade. Or if you trust your eye, you can sight down from multiple different angles and grind down the sides until they line up with the blade. Now we're starting by making the sides flat because we're going to drill a hole and put a pin through, and we want to drill into a flat, even, parallel handle. After getting the sides done, I want to grind in the profile shape of the handle. Now I'm not going to round anything out right now, I'm just going to grind the profile in. Using some reference marks from where the shoulder meets the bolster material, I'm grinding a very simple shape where the handle swells towards the end and narrows up towards the top. And with the profile done, I can confidently drill my pinhole. Now you want it either dead center, or if it's not dead center, offset towards the spine just a little bit. The pin will look pretty weird if it's offset towards the belly or the edge, so make sure it's offset towards the spine. I roughed up the outside of my pin just a little bit on a 36 grit to give the CA glue or the super glue something to bind onto. Down through there. I put some medium thick super glue into the hole and all around on the pin, sprayed it with some accelerator just to make sure it stays in place, and then trimmed off the excess using a hacksaw. With the pin in place, I can start grinding the rest of the handle. The first thing I'm going to do is reduce the thickness of the handle just a little bit and clean up the end where the handle swell is carved. I prefer a rounded handle, but if you like faceted handles, you can definitely put some layout lines and carve some facets into your handle. Personally, I think a rounded handle where everything is a little bit smoother is more comfortable, so that's what I'm doing. Now I grind in like a teardrop shape with the thicker part of the teardrop being on the spine, and then it gently slopes down to the edge. This gives the handle a really nice index, and that just basically means that when you pick it up without even looking, you know where the cutting edge is on this blade. Pinch grip is comfortable. It's balanced really well just in front of the bolster. To really refine the handle, you can't really do that on a hard platen, so it's best to remove that and use a J-Flex belt. Now J-Flex belts are really flexible and they curve around the shape of the handle and speed things up when it comes to finishing. I went from a 36 grit to rough shape everything straight to a brand new 220 J-Flex belt and removed all the 36 grit scratch lines. I'm not going for a mirror buff or shine on this handle, so I'm using 320 and then 800 grit to change the direction of the scratch lines so that they go in line with the handle and in line with the grain. This is going to look a little bit cleaner on the finished knife. The last step for this blade is to do what I call forced patina, just by simply etching it in ferric chloride. This is just jump starting the natural process that's going to occur on the blade using it for normal food prep. Before the forced patina, I like to get the blade sharp. I'm going to save stropping the edge for the very end though. Sharpening, I kept it very simple. I created a burr using a 220 grit belt on the grinder, and then I refined that edge just a little bit using the 1000 grit stone. This gives you a little bit more toothy of an edge, and an edge that I think performs a lot better in the kitchen. I'm using ferric chloride to achieve the forced patina, and I let it sit inside for about 5 to 10 minutes and then scrub off all the oxides using a piece of Scotch-Brite. If you've made it this far into the video, I'm guessing you're pretty interested in this stuff. And you might as well not do it alone. I started an online community, which is not only a place where I teach everything I know about this craft after 15 years of practice, but also a place to connect with fellow smiths literally from all over the world. It's a great place to post the projects you're working on at home, receive encouragement and support from like-minded smiths, connect with people who are going to teach you things that would have taken you years to learn on your own if you ever even learned it from their point of view. It's a really awesome way to get better at this craft. I've always improved the most by doing this craft with others. And that's why I started Backyard Bladesmiths. If you're interested, there's a paid group where you can be entered into quarterly giveaways, have access to detailed courses on epic projects, and also learn some of the ins and outs of the business of being a full-time bladesmith that I've learned from the past 3 years. If paying for a membership isn't in the budget right now, there's also a free community where you can still get plugged in and definitely improve in the craft. That black epoxy just gives you that perfect line. If there's a part of the process that I didn't cover in enough detail, let me know in the comments. I'd love to share everything I know about this craft if it's something that you want to learn. I appreciate you guys watching. I hope it was helpful, hope it was encouraging and inspiring. And if you're a bladesmith, hopefully it can be helpful if you want to get into making kitchen knives. Thanks so much for watching. I will see you guys in the next video.